All right, welcome back, everybody. Today, I am happy to be joined by Alejandro Varela, whose debut novel, The Town of Babylon, was a finalist for the National Book Award. His short story collection, The People Who Report More Stress, was one of Publishers Weekly's best works of fiction in 2023, a finalist for the International Latino Book Awards, and long-listed for the Aspen Words Literary Prize, the Short Story Prize, and the Penn Gene Stein Book Award. Varela is an editor-at-large of Apogee Journal, holds a master's degree in public health, and is based in New York. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks. Happy to be here, Alex.
So, your latest book is Middle Spoon. I know we've chatted a bit already, and you mentioned that you worked in public health for a while. And that's a super interesting journey to like National Book Award finalist author. I'm sure you get asked about it all the time, but I wanted to ask a little more specifically about how the stories in The People Who Report More Stress came to be, because I know that this was the first book you actually wrote, even though it was the second that you published. How'd you decide to write a short story collection? Where the stories come from? Did you see them leading you to where you are now?
I don't know, somewhere around 2011 or 2012, I finally committed to sitting down to write the screenplay I had always wanted to write. And as I sat down to do it, a director friend of mine who was visiting from France said, "You just have to go and do it. What's the first scene in this story?" And I told him the first scene is we're walking down the street in Brooklyn. And he said, "Go home and write that down." So I went home and I wrote it down and I realized I didn't know how to format a screenplay. So I just kind of did, sort of longhand prose. And then I realized I had a short story and I shared it with a few people who liked it. And then I shopped it around and then I published it in a small journal, Southampton Review, I think. And, uh, and I said, well, I have another one of these in my mind. So let me try this one. Well, I have this other one. I have this other one. And suddenly I had 30 or 25 or 30 stories and maybe six or seven of them I had gotten published. And I was just sort of shopping them around, trying to get this book to happen. But everywhere I went, my agent kept getting the same response. Oh, we love the writing. He's very good. Does he have a novel in him? We love the writing. He's very good. Does he have a novel in him? And I was getting not kind of, I was frustrated because I didn't see myself as a novel writer for a number of reasons, but primary of which was I couldn't imagine sticking to something for that long. I liked being able to see my entire story very in a small sort of band in my mind. And out of frustration, the short story that I had always thought this is going to be a longer short story, it morphed into The Town of Babylon, which is the novel that got published first. And then after that, Astor House published a short story collection.
So, I mean, that's really interesting. So, almost accidental. That's something I thought about a lot while reading the collection because so many of the stories have like a novel's worth of material in them. And I love short stories, probably reading short stories more than I love reading novels. But when I'm writing myself, I can never get that much into such a small space. For the novels you wrote, and maybe the Town of Babylon was to get the story collection published, but like this one, for example, how do you know you have a novel compared to a short story when it really feels like you could draw a novel out a lot of out of a lot of these stories?
Yeah, I think it's as simple as just, sort of self-control for me. How do I reduce? I mean, to be frank, the kernel, the whatever the idea is, the kernel of an idea that pops in, I can tell right away if it's something that's going to be sort of more epic in scope. And if I feel, if it feels very contained, although short stories can be epic too, but if it feels very contained to me, then I am like, okay, this is something that I can develop. I don't need to develop every single character in the same way. I don't need to follow their paths off of the tree. I always kind of have this same idea in my mind that it's this trunk of a tree, right? And with a novel, I'm able to follow the branches off. As long as I can come back, I have to keep coming back to this trunk, this main path. And with a short story, I don't think of it that way. I'm not pressed to keep it all in order because it's very easy for me to contain in my mind. I've never had a situation in which I'm like, oh, should I expand this and make this something longer? Despite what I just said, I knew I had this long idea, which is probably why I never wrote it down because I thought this is too big for a short story. That said, there's a story in The People Who Report More Stress. It's called Carlitos in Charge about the UN. And that one I have considered writing a follow up as a novel.
That's really interesting. I have a question about Carlitos in Charge in a second, but Middle Spoon is an epistolary novel, and
Yeah.
it's a series of emails, mostly to the boyfriend of the unnamed narrator, who is
Yeah.
also married. And what I'm interested in about that is you didn't really hold yourself to the traditional limitations of actually writing an email. Right? The book has scenes, its dialogue is formatted as dialogue. It sort of functions, the emails function as an entry point into what is sort of a, normal style. So I'm wondering, like, if I were to write something like that, I would be thinking too much about like what rules I'm breaking and if this or that. Like, did you just know from the outset it doesn't matter, this is good, I'm going to stick with it, or were you thinking a lot about, structuring a novel in that way?
A little bit of both. I was absolutely what you said kind of tortured me a little at first. I was like, there are rules to emails, there are rules to letters, there are rules to letters you're never going to send. And so I did struggle with it a little bit, but I did my best to fit it all in within the constraints of those things. Like I created a narrator who I wanted the reader to believe is so neurotic, is so obsessive that and wants so desperately to be right and to be good all the time to the point where like it's a bit too much, right? And I felt like he would write emails that rewrote history or that like where he would present the history of their relationship in a way. I mean, he's making a case throughout, and I think on the surface it's the case to Ben to try polyamory or to make this work. But personally, I think it's the case for affection and love because he's so heartbroken. And so in the moment, I think the narrator is just saying everything he can because he wants to feel better. And I think if he can intellectualize his pain away, that would be great for him. But at the same time, I think the writer, am making a case for someone who's in pain to get the love that they need. And so, in order to do that, I think this is where I invoke a little bit of my own personality and my own middle childness is that I want to make an airtight case all the time. I have like a sort of a political public health mind usually. And so I'm always thinking 10 steps ahead. What is Alex gonna think about, this first pass? It's like I already know what his argument's gonna be here. So then I need to make that case before he can. And then what would he say to that? And so I have to make that case before he can. And so that is the brain with which I wrote this. And then that's kind of my brain in a way, but I ratcheted it up for the sake of like the drama and the pain of this character who's spiraling. But yeah, so the emails I thought worked both. They made sense for someone like him to revisit an entire episode from a year ago while he's talking to the person who had lived that episode with him, right? So essentially he's saying, this is how it happened, and this is how it could have gone, and this is how. So there's that, but then as the writer, it's also really great because I want you to know the history of this relationship or of this story so that you can follow along, yeah, and become invested. So it allowed me to do both. I never, to be fair, I didn't think, or at least the challenge for me was to write these emails in a way where it was believable that someone like him would write an email like this. Like it wasn't like, oh, I'm just using email and now I could just say whatever and forget that I'm in an email. I still wanted the reader to feel like, even if they got lost for a moment, that it made sense that he would write an email like this because this is who he is.
I wanted to ask you about the tone of the novel. It feels like he's talking down to Bennett points. He has a lot of sort of critiques of, the world itself, which sometimes feels like he's just like looking for closure or some sort of justification in those things. There's the chapter where he gets super infuriated at the misuse of bike lanes, and you can just like feel that anger pulsing through him, even though it's in an email, which is like, later on. How did you think about capturing mood within the personal addresses? Something that is inherently out of the moment.
Yeah. So the narrator isn't just heartbroken, doesn't just have a history of like, I don't know, maybe like some sort of psychological or socioeconomic struggle that has informed his view, his world lens, his social justice outlook on the world. He also, as we find out, is dealing with mental health issues, right? And so I wasn't only, it's funny, I sat down to write a novel about grief because I wasn't familiar with heartbreak of that kind. And when I became familiar with it, I thought, oh, this is an insane emotion, like roller coaster of emotions. And I would really love to capture it in a way that is accessible to anyone, so that anyone who's ever been in love or who's experienced grief, period, can be like, oh shoot, I've been through this. I know what this is. I don't know why I became so focused on that. I think it's because I was so caught off guard by that type of grief. And I thought, how come I've never talked to anybody about this before? How come I've never understood what this is before? I want to see if I can write this in a way that anyone would pick this up and be like, oh shit, this sucks. But then at the same time, we have a person who has to live their life. They're not a 17-year-old, they're middle aged. And so a 17-year-old could wallow and maybe be annoying for 319 pages, but a 45-year-old is wallowing, is annoying for 319 pages, and is concerned with the state of the world and with parenting and with their job and all of the other things. And in this case, with a spouse, with a husband. And so I was trying to create this mood of not only pain, but of spiral. And it, it's 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 a lot of pieces at once, Alex, because I think once we realize that this what mental health issues he's dealing with, in a way it's like a retconning, because we think it's all about pain and grief, right? Like anyone can have their heart broken and be annoying. I mean, if you've ever had your heart broken or one of your friends has, like it is annoying and it is incredibly selfish, because you think the world is ending and it's all about you, and the rest of the world is more or less fine. Never mind that everyone else is probably dealing with heartache too, but you think it's only happening to you, and no one can understand it. It's horrible, horrible, horrible. And so I wrote from that perspective, that this grief is like really difficult and it's all consuming and selfish. And then suddenly there's the whole OCD piece of it. And that adds a complete different layer, because maybe grief isn't terrible. Maybe grief is just fine. I mean, I didn't say that, and I didn't really want to explore that. But after the fact, I realized that, like, by getting into, but then that was it. Like grief and heartbreak of any kind, grief of any kind, death, the end of a relationship, the end of like the world, a pandemic, bad president, you name it, war. It does not happen in a vacuum. So you have to be at the same time. It just, in some ways, it amplifies everything. Maybe that the narrator, if he had not been heartbroken, that bike lane stuff and the annoying bikers wouldn't be so difficult, right? Like he might be turned off, but it wouldn't have led to this like catharsis in this letter. But it's also funny. Like I wrote that chapter to be funny. I didn't. It wasn't. It allowed me to get some of these ideas out, but it was meant to also balance the obsession with Ben. Because even as I was writing it, I remember thinking, oh God, this is so much about Ben. Like, how do I branch out of this? Like, how do I, this conceit is only going to take me so far. And then I was like, wait a second, why can't this narrator be as obsessive about everything? Is it just Ben? Like, who is he? And that's when all of the other emails started to come in. Initially, the first draft, it was only emails to Ben. And then with each successive draft, it was like, okay, the Department of Sanitation, okay, the New York Times, okay, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the mother, the children, the husband, so on and so forth.
I wanted to ask, I didn't even have a question, but I do think it's really interesting, the OCD aspect, because I mean, you have a degree in public health. You said you taught it for a number of years. I mean, I feel like when we think about what OCD is, it's almost just sort of like a joke that we make. It's just like, oh, that's my OCD or whatever. It's like, how did you think about, I don't know if like destigmatizing it is the right word, but how did you think about putting that into the book, like that specific disease, naming it? Yeah.
So it's funny that you said that, because there's a short story in here called She and Her Kid and Me and Mine, and it's about a play date. And at some point, like one of the characters wants to help fill the dishwasher, and the narrator says, "Oh no, 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 no! It's I got it. It's my OCD. I'm OCD about this." And then immediately he gets into his head and he's like, "Oh my God, OCD is a real illness. I probably shouldn't joke about it." And I think I have been curious about OCD for a long time. I think I also sort of speak about it very jokingly. And then I started reading about it while I was writing this book, which is kind of weird because I've never added an element before, something so big in like subsequent drafts. It's usually the big pieces are always there in the first draft. And it's the 10th most common illness in the world, according to the World Health Organization. I had no idea. I had no idea. And I imagine like every illness, especially mental health illnesses, there's a spectrum. Like not everyone is the same kind of OCD. And that is true. There are different categories to OCD. And you might be a just perfect OCD person where like you need your subway car doors to line up with the exit of the train station. And if they don't, that drives you crazy. You might be the kind of person who picks up their phone, sort of compulsively, even though you've already done it, and you go to the same 7 websites, like one after the other, even though you just did that. It just becomes like a routine. And if you don't do it, there's just a little part of you and so that too is a spectrum. For some people, it's like you may not be able to function for the rest of the day if you don't check all 7 websites 700 times. And for some people, it's just kind of like, oh, that feels awkward. I'll check later. And so as I was reading and learning about this and talking to my own therapist about OCD, I realized that there's just so much here we don't know. And that if something could affect such a huge portion of the population, I already have it like kind of I don't know, is it a bugaboo about like us not taking mental health seriously, about us sort of distinguishing between mental and physical health, because the mental is physical, like it's neurochemical. And so, it is part of the body, it is part of the physiology of us. And I'm annoyed that like health insurance has different like mental health is one thing. It should all be one piece. And so in all of my work, there is mental health. To the Town of Babylon delves into schizophrenia. And I think, yeah, I don't think I know it's a combination of my own mental health struggles in my life, not schizophrenia, the people in my life who have these illnesses, and wanting to present them in a way that's respectful, that there's dignity to it. Especially when I was writing about schizophrenia, I felt like I knew it as the illness that a tertiary character would have in like an ER, and then they kill someone, and then they become this like horribly, and then you're like, wait, it's an illness, like it's an illness. And so it's very important to me that when I talk about mental health, people, it's 360 degrees. Like you see all of it, you understand it, where it's coming from. It's totally humanized because it is human. So that's where that came from. Just a lot of reading, a lot of question asking, a lot of thinking about myself and my own way of viewing the world. And it fits so nicely with this like downward spiral for this person.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, she and her kid and me and mine was one of my favorites, and it's interesting because you're like the character does joke about it, then he calls himself on it. Like, I mean, because like she comes into the house, he's so worried about how dirty his kitchen looks and where these cracks are, and he's everything he does, he's like, oh, she's just waiting to tell people that, me and my husband need a woman in the house, and
Right,
it's
right,
sort of he's just totally spiraling, and he's incredibly judgmental of her.
right.
He's interested in her. She does interesting things. She's like investigating the government's use of drones or something like that. Like, how do you handle the complexities of judgment? Because you have a lot of a lot of your characters are very judgmental, but they're also very judgmental of themselves, and they're worried that other people are judging them the same way they're judging those. And it's such an interesting dynamic the way that that sort of operates in your stories
Yeah.
and in this novel.
I am, I'll admit it, an anxious human, and I have been for most of my adult life. And I have been very concerned about where that anxiety comes from. And I'm not as neurotic or as anxious as my narrators are, I'd like to believe. Um, but I wouldn't be an interesting narrator. And so I think anxiety sucks, OCD probably sucks, schizophrenia sucks to deal with. But maybe not schizophrenia in what I'm about to say, but things like OCD and anxiety, they're quite funny on the page, you know? And I think there's some levity to having someone spiral like that and be thinking about so many things at once. And it's interesting because for some folks, I'm basing this on the feedback I've gotten from people, my DMs primarily, but some people really identify with that and think, thank you for representing what mental illness looks like on the page and for it having some humanity. I feel, especially the OCD in middle school, the number of messages I'm getting from people about OCD is incredible. But for some people, it's quite funny and they just think, it's this is humorous. And I think there are a lot of us who behave the way these narrators do. Like it's not fiction. That way of like double conscious, like holding so much at once. Like you're trying to be a good person, but you're also feeling all of the shit that's happened to you in your life, excuse my language, all that's happened to you in your life. And if it is around race and class and gender and sexuality, then your guard's up. You're constantly wondering what's safe, who's going to judge you, blah, 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 blah. But then you're doing okay. Like this is a person who financially is all right, right? And so they have this room to breathe. It's called the people who report more stress, right? It's not the people who are more stressed. And so it's this ability to be self-aware of the things that are happening around you. That's such a luxury in a way. It can be torturous, but at the same time, it gives you perspective. Like this guy, whether my narrator with in Middle Spoon or in this one, he may be annoying, but I'm gonna stand up for him a little and say, at least he's keeping it to himself, right? Like we are privy to it as readers, but he's not as obnoxious as we think because he doesn't hit send on the emails. And he's not as obnoxious as we think because he treats that person who comes to the house with a lot of respect and keeps these things. What I'm trying to do for the reader is transcribe the mind a little bit and have fun with that, like to see what anxiety looks like, to see what happens when you climb this ladder and then you end up in places where you don't feel like you fit in. But this was what we were told to do: climb and get a job and do better and get great grades and buy a home and get married and have kids. But A, you didn't take everyone else with you in your life. So how are you ever going to fully enjoy that? Like you still have siblings and cousins and family and your neighbors who are poor. And so how could you possibly ever fully enjoy it? And at the same time, you have room and peace of mind to see what you're doing, to be like, dude, you're spiraling. Well, why are you spiraling? Like you don't need to be, or you could be fully wrong. So that is, I think, a very true and real brain. And I know that now. When I was writing it, I didn't think it. I knew it was sort of a version of my brain. But now that I have been in touch with so many people over these last 4 or 5 years who've read my work, they're like, oh my God, that's my brain. Oh my God, that's how I function in this world. Oh my God, oh my God. And so then I realized there's so many of us who are doing this, who are trying to function in the reality that we have, but not comfortable in it at all. And so I thought that's why I like the internal dialogue and the internal sort of perspective, because it's very raw. Is it alienating to some readers? Absolutely, Alex. I think there is many people who love it as hate this kind of spirally or obsessive way of thinking. But I had to read Catcher in the Rye when I was a kid, and so now you have to read this. Like it's okay. He was annoying too. And I was gonna say something else about. No, that's okay. It'll come back to me.
The thing that I love about this book and the thing that I love about fiction in general is the want to capture like reality. And it can be funny at times. It can also be kind of like unnerving to exist in this mind because I do feel like at times like that's how I'm thinking obsessively about how someone's perceiving me, perceiving them in a certain way. And it creates such a spiral. And yeah, I mean, right? Like when you think about 1960s, 70s, white male fiction, John Updike, like it doesn't feel like you're capturing like what it is to exist on the page. It feels like you're boiling it down. You're making the rules simpler. This is not what the world feels like to me. So, whether that's sort of experimental fiction, whether it's, this sort of just trying to really capture what anxiety feels like, I really enjoy that stuff. You mentioned luxury. I'm really interested in the idea of relationships as a luxury, especially in Middle Spoon, but also in the
Mm-hmm.
stories. What's the story? I think it was in Other Man,
Mm-hmm.
where it's a similar sort of thing. Somebody has, I think he has a husband as well, and he is sort of going on these dating apps, and he recognizes like, man, all of these people are just looking for the thing that I already have. And here I am, sort of like double dipping or, whatever. In Middle Spoon, it's a similar kind of thing because he recognizes that he's only able to love Ben because of how much his husband loves him. And so it's like we wouldn't really exist without this. So, it's very interesting that dynamic. How do you see that in your work, the necessity of relationships versus relying too heavily on others, excessively relying on others?
That's a great question.
I know it's kind of big, but
No, no, no. I love this sort of question. And this one in particular, my public health training, what I learned in school and afterward, can be sort of boiled down to one idea, and it is that the bonds of community are a buffer for almost anything. And you and I having dinner every night with like seven of our friends, or you and I living in a neighborhood where we trust everyone on the block and we leave our doors unlocked, activates neural regions in our brain that counteract and or overtake the stress of the day, even if you have a shitty job, even if you work at the DMV or the TSA, even if like you have to put up with someone else's crap. If you have this community, it is so insulating, not isolating, insulating. Like it just gives you this buffer to life. And so relationships are so important. They are so important. And in capitalism and in a hyper capitalistic country like the United States, it is very difficult to keep those bonds up. They used to be family bonds, but if you are incentivized to move away from your family to make it, to climb the ladder, so then you've already cut off something there. You can talk to your mom on the phone every day for the rest of your life, but you don't live near her anymore. And that you didn't used to be the case, right? And so you make other friends, you choose your family, other people who are there for you day to day. But we not all of us succeed at that. Some of us only have one good friend. Some of us go home every night and just microwave our dinners. And so relationships to me aren't just fun and important, they are life-saving. And I try to capture that in my work. Now, as far as romantic relationships in all three books, I am questioning conformity because I do believe the American dream is bull. I do believe that the things that people, you can't have 330 million CEOs. You can't. And so if everyone is striving to get to the very top, like it's not fair. So if we accept that there can't be 330 million CEOs, then we have to live in an environment in a society that makes it easy for people to live with dignity, even if they're not at the pinnacle of the pyramid or the triangle or whatever. And so calling bull on that, when you realize that that doesn't make sense, it's a little like watching The Matrix. You're like, wait a second, I see this clearly. It's not going to work. This experiment, this system of government, this way that we organize ourselves, we can sustain it for a little bit, and some of us can do just fine. But as a sort of global experiment, it's just not going to work. And knowing that about myself, knowing that, and I'm stealing here from George Michael a little bit, the musician, the British dead musician, but I I was raised to think that being queer, being gay at the time is what I called it, was wrong. And so everything I felt was wrong and bad. And I didn't handle that well. And I had the tumultuous years and the difficult years and the drinking years and all of that. And if you're lucky enough to come out the other side and be like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. People are just ignorant and they need to catch up and everything is fine. That's it. It's huge, Alex, because now nothing makes sense. Because that was the thing that I was told was underpinned society. And so everything else functions. So now, do I believe them about the police? Do I believe them about Israel? Do I believe them about like sexuality, relationships? I was also raised to believe that real love meant monogamy and complete and total devotion to a partner. Complete and total devotion. Everything else is sacrificed for this relationship to work. And the older I get, the more I question that. And I wanted to question that in this book. Is love and affection scarce? Is it something finite that you can only give to one person? And if you give it to someone else, can that other person still exist? And the truth is, I'm not hardwired for that. Or maybe I am, and life has gotten in the way. But the husband in Middle Spoon, he's an aspirational figure. Those people like that exist in my life. Compersion, I don't know if you're familiar with the term, but this idea that it exists in the polyamorous community or world is that I derive pleasure and or joy from your pleasure and joy, my partner, even if it's sexual, even if it's romantic. Like, okay, Alex, you and I together, and one day you said to me, I met someone else, and I'm like, are you happy? And you're like, yeah, and it's hot. I'm like, really? That's awesome. That's really cool. And I'm not threatened at all. These people exist because they're in my life, and I still am like, how do we bottle this? Like, how do we give this out to people? Because I'm still so caught up in like jealousy and so it was very important for me for this husband character to exist, and he exists throughout my work because he exists in the real world. But for the average reader, this is like a boogeyman. Like this is not possible. There's no way. Not a boogeyman, a straw man. I don't know what the term is. Like it's just not possible that anyone could be like this. And so I've been very fascinated in the last few years with trying to, if not convince, present this figure in my work. So, and I would like to do so in a kind of more dynamic way in the next few books because they exist. And so this, like all my work, is really about questioning conformity. Like, why do we do the things that we do, and can we live outside of the bounds of normal and still be happy and productive in society? And as someone who, like, grew up around in a white area, grew up kind of working class and poor in a wealthier area, you know, is gay, has kids, is married, all of these at every step, if I had listened to what conformists say, I wouldn't be any of those things. I would be a closeted angry alcoholic who, who wasn't living their lives, honestly. And so in that way, I'm like, I might die and never know the limits of like breaking with conformity. There's so many things I haven't even begun to know about, like, oh my God, it's totally cool to live this way. I had no idea. And this is not meant to be a pro poly book. I didn't write it that way. I didn't intend for it to be that way. It was really meant to be a book that asks questions or that makes people ask questions.
First of all, husband character was awesome. I mean, like just the most interesting character, and
Hmm.
the focus of the book obviously wasn't on him, but I completely agree with that sort of assessment. Like, I know the idea of like polyamory is controversial, but like it really didn't feel at all to me like you were arguing for anything. It felt like just, you use the phrase lack of imagination a lot. It felt like just like questioning traditional notions of love. I was taking like a modernist course at the same time, and I was reading this D.H. Lawrence novel, and I was like, oh, this is the same thing. Like, he's like, why are we not able to be individuals and also in a relationship? Why does it have to be this? And I'm reading this, and I'm like, 100 years apart. It's just questioning, what we're told about relationships, about what it means to love.
Is that
Uh,
Sons and Lovers? No.
it was Women in Love.
Oh, Women in Love. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I have one more question before we read from Middle Spoon. Because you mentioned community at the beginning of that answer, and specifically in Other Man, because which we talked about a little bit,
Yeah.
where this man is online dating, and he has concern about it, the accessibility of it, the inability to have human interactions, and on the topic of sexual community in Middle Spoon, the narrator kind of diagnoses Ben as treating his pain with sex, that the more sex he has, the more he can render human contact less meaningful. So there's that sort of sexual aspect of community, what it means for us to devalue humans as individuals. And then obviously the narrator in Middle Spoon has a large community, but I don't know how much he's getting out of it. He's always talking to Tracy. He has two therapists.
Hmm.
He gets relationship advice from his doctor. So in a way, he's utilizing community in an awesome way, but also like, is it really helping? I just wonder how you think about. You talked a bit about it already, but just that, yeah, that notion of community in
Yeah.
your work.
You know, I think the more one centers themselves, the more they lose touch with their community. And sometimes that centering can't be avoided. And so I gave an earlier example, like if you leave home, let's say you grew up somewhere rural or in the suburbs and your family struggled, but you're very tight knit, and then you get a great job and you go to the Ivy League. Well, you go to the Ivy League school, you get the great job, you work on Wall Street, and you never see any of these people anymore. You send checks and you visit on the holidays and you talk to your parents, but you don't have, your life has become something completely different. And yours life has really become about success at all costs. And then there are the golden handcuffs, and then you can never leave that way of being until you retire. That is, I would say, a bad centering. A healthy and necessary centering is like, okay, I grew up in a conservative Catholic community. I am non binary. It's very difficult for me to function in this way, but this is who I am. And so every day that I don't receive acceptance and or self-determine is a bad day for me. It's a bad life for me. And so in this book, the main character, the narrator, has a non-binary kid. And there's a moment in the book where they encounter a few transphobic folks in New York City, or they have a few transphobic episodes. One of them at the school and one of them on the subway. And a few days later, the kid is getting ready for school, and the dad sees that the kid is doing like pink tights, and I don't know if there's earrings or makeup. I don't remember. And he starts to dissuade his kid from wearing these items of clothing. And as he's dissuading the child, he realizes he's being transphobic. Like he's more afraid of of a confrontation in the outside world than he is about the self-determination of his child. And so he just like, reins it in, grits his teeth and say, where do you want, baby? It's okay. And then he says, I'm going to compromise with myself. I'm going to support my kid to be who they are. And I'm not going to make eye contact with anyone on the walk to school. Right. Because he's sick of the eye rolls, the judgment, all the stuff, the looks. And that to me was an example of what happens in our society when you break with conformity, when you decide, I'm going to do what's right for me. It's not hurting anyone. No one else in your community wants that. And in this case, in some cases. And so you find yourself choosing between, do I live my life or do I keep my family and my neighbors? And so in this book, there's that example. And then there's the poly example. Like what he says at some point, or maybe I've just written about it and I don't write a book, is progressive except for polyamory, PEPs. It used to be when I was growing up, when I, in my early political days at college and stuff, there used to be this term PEPs, progressive except for Palestine. Everyone was progressive, but when it came to Palestine, they were still very conservative. I would add to that PEP, progressive except for polyamory. And frankly, I've noticed progressive except for public schools. I have a lot of, not just liberal friends, I have a lot of lefty friends for whom if it's not a perfect public school, the fate of their children is like becomes like so important. Oh my God, no. I know in every other way I'm anti-cop, I'm anti this, I'm anti that, but my kid has to like feel safe and heard at every moment. And that's dangerous for that's bad for society. Like that's bad for community. It's bad. It really is centering yourself. And progressive except for polyamory, I think I've also seen a lot of that. And so that's what he's experiencing in this moment. But he doesn't want to lose his community, is the point of this. It's very long-winded, Alex, but the point of this is that community is so important for him. It could be so easy. His friend David at one point says, dude, live your life, stop caring what other people think. And it's so easy to hear that advice and be like, yes, that's empowering. But no, not if you love your neighbors, not if you love your community, not if you like realize how important it is for us to be cohesive in order for all of us to be healthier and to survive. That just makes you want to explain things in a way that are more accessible. It makes you want to write a book about things in a way that like I'm going to endear myself and I'm going to break down these ideas and these topics in ways that maybe, okay, you didn't love it at the beginning, but by the end you're like, oh, it's just humans. It's just part of the human experience. And so I find myself being a bridge person all my life. Maybe it's because my parents are immigrants and I had to interpret a lot and translate for them. But I'm always like, how do I bridge this group with this group? How do I make people see this in a way that makes sense? That's one way of living in this life. Another way is just like guns blazing. Like, this is me, fuck you, like, deal with it. I've never really been that person. I respect that way of being. I haven't been that person. And I think that comes across in my work.
So I mentioned a section in Middle Spoon that maybe we could read, and then I had a question
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
Or-
Here we go. Page 57. Dear Ben, I'm in the ER. I'm fine, but the bedside manner of the staff in this hospital is atrocious. To agree that would be comedic if not for all the suffering. The nurses and medical assistants will not look me directly in the eye because doing so would require them to answer my questions or attend to my needs. My needs are simple. I want to know when they're bringing my friend a blanket. It's not cold in the ER, but she's cold because sick, dehydrated people often are cold. Or do they feel cold? Is there a difference? Every worker here is cold too. Their dismissive attitudes are an arsenal of fogs, daggers, laser beams. I imagine a field of war as the only worse environment for the ill. On the other hand, I'm finding the atmosphere familiar. There's a continuity between this poor care and the way you're treating me. In particular, the way you behaved the last time I saw you. The day after we broke up, I proposed we meet in person. Our relationship simply couldn't end over the phone, I argued. You agreed. After dropping Nico off at school, I made my way to your place. Both of us were exhausted, but whereas I felt desperate and did little to hide it, you appeared resolute. You were terse, never interrupting your routine, brushing your teeth, patting your curls in the mirror, washing your breakfast dishes, tucking your shirt into your pants. It was 8:30. Our rushed chat did nothing to bring about closure. You and I and our words continued meandering onto the street past the many people who moved with urgency and the few who didn't. At a corner, as we waited for the light to change in our favor, we had ample time to regard each other from the distance you'd imposed, which we did, until I moved closer to you and brought my face to yours. It was primarily out of habit, but I'd be lying if I said my overture wasn't also guided by hope. It didn't yet feel as if we were over, and I was aggrieved at my lack of input in the matter. I felt then, as I do now, a terrible thing was happening to me only, not us. A grand relationship was coming to an end because of a one-sided realization. You're never going to leave your husband. It's true. I am never going to leave my husband. An odd point of contention on your part, and an even odder epiphany because you knew from the outset I was never going to walk away from my family. This, the balancing and near juggling of multiple loves, is the fundamental component of polyamory. When I leaned in to kiss you, you pulled away, the way someone does when a bee swirls past. I'd become, in a short period of time, something to fear. Come on, babe, I said at that nothing special intersection that separates Williamsburg from Bushwick, across the street from one of the hundreds of bodega cum markets that had in recent years added organic to its marquee despite offering almost no organic products. You apologized for recoiling, then you kissed me. It was simultaneously the best, familiar, and worst, distant, kiss we'd ever shared. I wish I had known it would be our last. I might have made more of it, lingered for longer, pressed my hand on the small of your back. You could be a nurse at this hospital, Ben, cold, guarded, angry at the unfairness of your situation, emotionally taxed, frustrated by your inability to see your future clearly, helpless in the face of the invisible structures and inefficient systems inhibiting your happiness. It's a proper shit show in this ER. People are calling out for water, for warmth, for meds, for food, and through it all, the staff remains committed to their rudeness, or rather, their aggressive apathy. About an hour ago, I've been here for nearly 4 hours, I successfully resisted posting something on social media about what I was witnessing. I feared my few followers would assume I was the patient. I also worried I didn't understand the reasons for the ineptitude and callousness of the hospital staff, and would thus be placing blame at the feet of the wrong people. I'd be guilty of one of those gotcha attacks that cause shame and condemnation but lead to no solutions. The elderly woman on the gurney next to my friend is writhing in discomfort, full on thrashing, the hem of her gown up to her chest, her hair a static-induced terror, her white, near translucent skin and purple veins a lost Goya painting. She's restless and screams without compunction. She's been doing so the entire time I've been here. She too needs a blanket. She also wants water, without ice. She wants her sister. She wants other people too. She holds her hand to her ear as if it were a phone and shouts, Alexa, where's my sister? Alexa, get me a blanket. For 20 uninterrupted minutes, she yells for water. At last, I get up and request water. The nurse on duty snaps at me not to get involved in other patients' care. You have no right. I ask if she's Alexa. Alexa? Responds the beleaguered worker with droopy lids and a mask across the lower third of her face. I tell her it's the name the elderly woman has been calling out repeatedly. Oh, she means the Amazon thing. I'm briefly embarrassed for not having made the association. I return to my seat beside my friend's contemporary bed, where I have an unobstructed view of the tortured elderly patient, whom the staff ignores with what can only be called dedication. Someone they could easily appease, in the process allowing all the other patients in her vicinity to rest, including my poor friend, who already finds it impossible to sleep through the fluorescent lighting, the incessant beeping of the various monitors that snake up from her arms and chest like an eviscerated robot, and of course, the old lady's spine-tingling lamentations. One tactical move could improve the lives of at least a dozen people. Bring her the water. Alas. Alas means wings in Spanish. I can't make the connection between the two words, alas and alas in English. but the image of a massive bird swooping into this ER to cause chaos and rescue the patients is soothing.
The flow of that section, right? You could be a nurse at this hospital, cold, guarded, angry at the unfairness of your situation. It's very funny. The writing is also really precise because, like, it starts with a kind of like scare tactic almost. Like, you could imagine him sending this and he just wants Ben to read, I'm in the ER and get scared or whatever. So it's like that slow reveal, which again is is interesting for emails because you don't necessarily think of like that as a form of like tricks with the writing, but also it makes sense for the character to do it. I just wanted to ask a broad question
Yeah,
about your writing process because there's such attention to detail.
mm,
And like I said, I love the writing in this section. I think
yeah,
when we talked, you might have said 5 months, but I think you said
yeah.
5 weeks you wrote the first draft.
I wrote the first draft in 5 weeks, and then I edited over about a year and change. And when I wrote the first draft, it came out like as like a novella. I thought that's what it was going to be, a novella. And I was contracted to write two other books with my previous publisher. And I asked my agent, I said, "Do you think they let me do this?" And they said, "I'll ask." And they said, "No, we don't want a novella." And then he was going to see if we could sell that elsewhere. But I had 54,000 words maybe, and then or 60. And then when I the next time I edited, I added another, and then I added another 30, and then I subtracted 20. So it was like that until finally I had my favorite part of the writing process is editing. God, I long to have a beginning, middle, and end, even if it's not good, just because I know I can make it better in the editing process. That said, with each writing project, the first draft is stronger and stronger and stronger. I think if I could dig up, and I could, that initial novella draft after 5 weeks, you'd see this book in there. Yeah.
The thing I'm like working on right now, I agree I love editing so much more, but
Yeah.
I find it impossible to write like a first draft front to back without being like, okay, I have this chapter, I've got to make it as good as possible before I can
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
next.
Well, I'll tell you, my friend Lisa, who is a writer, Lisa Xiao Chen, she wrote The Activities of Daily Living, which is a fantastic book. Um, when I was going through this process of they want a novel and all I have are short stories, she said, I wouldn't, if I were you, read as you go. Just keep going. And it was so simple, but it was kind of radical for me because I was the kind of short story writer that would sit in a cafe, write 750 words, go to the bathroom, come back, edit those 750 words, order a coffee, come back, edit them again, and keep doing that throughout the day, which is why the beginnings of books and stories are always stronger than the end because you're always going back to the first. It's like the first child. And then the middle child gets ignored. And by the third, you're like, oh, they can change their own diaper. And so that's why I highly encourage when you're writing something and you go to pick it up, which I'm doing right now with the short story I'm working on, just pick a section in the middle or at the end and start there and treat that like the beginning. See it with fresh eyes, give it as much importance as you do the first paragraph of everything you work on. And so, but I followed her advice. I wrote Babylon, my first book, my first novel, very concerned that I wouldn't be able to do it. I wrote that in 13 weeks, but over the course of some time, because I gave up in the middle and was like, I'm not a novel writer. And then I wrote it all in 13 weeks and I never looked back once, Alex. I never looked back. And I think part of it was like, I just let go. I was like, just keep writing. Who cares? But I was like, wait, I'm moving from this trunk and I'm on this branch and I'm so far out. This branch is so long. Am I going to be able to find my way back? I was so afraid to actually read it, unlike my short stories, because I thought this is going to be nonsense. There's going to be no continuity between chapter one and chapter 30. And so, to my surprise, there was. And I was happy about that. And I think once you do it, then you demystify the process. And now I'm not as afraid, but I don't go back and read novels while I'm writing them.
Yeah, it sounds so terrifying. And that's exactly how I feel like it would just I would
I do allow myself if I stop, sorry, if I stop in the middle of a paragraph or in the middle of a page, I'm not like such a
yeah, yeah, yeah.
purist about it.
It's also such a great excuse to just be like, I'm gonna go reread the first couple of chapters instead of working on the
And it makes
next.
you feel so productive too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're like, wow, this is so much better than it was this morning.
Yeah, right, right.
Okay, so I have a question. I have about two more questions that maybe we'll read again. I'm sorry this went so long.
No, I'm having a great time.
So you mentioned Carlitos in Charge, which is the first story in the People Who Report More Stress. And it's about someone with a public health background who ends up working at the UN. He finds the whole thing to be a sort of like charade where, data is irrelevant and what matters instead is like who's sleeping with who. I wanted to ask about the differing perspectives in the collection, as well as the novels, because I think they both kind of fit this. But you portray the effects of a system on people, as well as portray people who have a great grasp on those effects, but are on the other side, like are reaping the benefits of it. How do you decide on the angle you want to take and the importance of having both? And I guess what I'm saying is like oftentimes your characters are the criticizer, but also like the criticized. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah. So we talked earlier about like you mentioned white writers in the 60s and 70s, and I have to admit a bit of ignorance. I've read like one each of the book, but never enough to be like I understand the canon well from that era.
Yeah, yeah.
But I am under the impression that there were a lot of kind of acceptable neurotic views of contemporary life at the time, like suburban living, like Revolutionary Road, the movement from like the cities to the suburbs. And then even like branch out into like Woody Allen, not his writing, except of his films, like this sort of constant neurotic. I wouldn't say Revolutionary Road is neurotic. I would say John Updike Rabbit series is
Mhm.
low key neurotic. Like it's a lot of observation and also kind of centering, but maybe not neurotic. Okay, I'm gonna give that one some more thought. But my point is that I believe there are middle generations, which is what the middle refers to in Middle Spoon. There are a lot of middles there, but it's not just the relationship, which is the obvious one. It's like this narrator who is between classes, grew up a certain way and is a certain way now, between generations, the value, the importance he places on his parents and his children, between two therapists, between two lovers. And I don't know if I ever mentioned it, but he is a middle child like I am. So I always also get a kick out of that. But a lot of the kind of artists that came out of and we value today who had these multiple look like gazes at the past and the future. Their parents were immigrants, whether it was Jewish or German or Italian, their parents were immigrants, or they grew up poor and now they're upper middle class. And it is this destabilization, I think, this kind of you can't believe how lucky you are or how good life is, but then you also can't let go of the stress of what life used to be like. And I feel very fortunate. I am the middle generation in my line. My parents got here, they worked their asses off. Financially, they have never felt particularly secure. And now here I am. I own my home. I have this writing career. Life is going pretty well for me. And my kids, I don't know if they're going to understand what it means to be working class. I don't know if they're going to understand solidarity. I mean, I'm trying to raise them to be thoughtful, good humans, but are they ever, they can understand, they can take a class on labor politics and unions and see the importance of solidarity, but are they ever going, they're never going to have seen their parents like with their head in their hands, like being like, how are we going to survive? Like that kind of thing changes your life, even when you don't realize it's happening. So when I'm writing, I'm thinking I have my feet in both of these worlds. Like I am very fortunate in some ways to have played the capitalist game right and to be on the rung of the ladder where I am. But I'm also aware of how much harder it is for other people. And I'm aware of how much the people on my rung are making it harder for other people. And the people above us make it harder for us. And so I feel implicated, but then also I won't shut up about it because I'm hoping that like if we don't talk about these things earnestly, like I said, my kids might be people who can communicate these ideas even better than me, but it'll be a different thing. And I think in this country, as that family sort of settles in that line of people, you lose that past. And so, and especially if you make it, you have less interest and then less connection to the struggle that brought you here. And so I think that's what I'm kind of trying to communicate. I don't know that I answered your question, but I think whatever you asked me made me feel like that's the route I wanted to take.
I think it does. I mean, that's definitely the way that I think about things too. I'm probably more like in the position your like kids are going to be in because it's like, my parents went to school and they had to do certain things and, they were trying to get out of, poverty or whatever the case may be. And now here I am getting to study, creative writing as an undergrad major. And it just feels a little ridiculous. And there's also this perspective There's like certain things you feel like you need to address because now you're reaping the benefits of this thing that's
I think John Adams has a very famous quote about this. I wish I could remember, but no, we are the farmers, and our parents are the farmers, and this is that, and we are the politicians, so that our children can be the artists.
Oh yeah.
And and then Alec Baldwin's character on 30 Rocks is like, our parents picked crops so that our children, so that I could run a corporate studio and my kids could snowboard. And I feel that. And it's funny because I think everyone should have an opportunity to everything. Like, I wonder if my dad would have been a great writer. And there no signs point to that, by the way. But given the opportunities that he gave me, might he have ended up being a writer? Might he have ended up being someone on the stage, or just doing something completely different? And similarly with my mom. And so I want absolutely every human to be able to, and in a world in which everyone does 4 hours of like labor, and then labor doing jobs that they don't really want to do, and then the rest of the day they get to be their artistic selves. I love that idea of that world. That sounds like an Ursula Le Guin book. But I'm also fascinated by people who try to jump the line very quickly. And I know I haven't really fleshed this idea out. I've been only thinking about it recently. If my parents, like, maybe I needed to be a doctor first, right? So that my kids could be the writers. And then their writing wouldn't be so suffused with all of this neuroses and tension about like imposter syndrome and survival and anxiety and who knows? I don't know. Yeah,
No,
I
that I
shouldn't.
mean that's fascinating to think about. Yeah,
I
it's
shouldn't be spitballing these ideas because ultimately we want all of those perspectives,
yeah.
especially in literature.
There's another story in the collection called Midtown West Side Story, which
Yeah,
is a really interesting plot and isn't about pop music, really. But it opens with a Madonna song. And I kind of wonder what role, not just pop music, but pop culture plays for you in the writing of these books. Because like you said, was it he wrote to the Grammys in Middle Spoon and he talks about like the Oscars and who should get what awards. It almost becomes like a self-soothing tool in Middle Spoon. Like I know these things, so everything's gonna be okay or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, I sort of wonder how you see that stuff popping up, not just in the novel, but in the story collection where maybe it's yeah.
I hadn't heard anyone say it that way before, Alex. That's great. A self-soothing tool, yeah, because it fits with the kind of the structure even of something like OCD, where the compulsion gives you temporary relief and you can relax, but it's a compulsion, so it never solves anything. And the relief is always temporary. It gives you control when you feel like there is no control elsewhere. For me, I am a pop culture nerd. That's how I grew up. I blame some of that on my mother, and blame is the wrong word because I love her for it. She was just a big music head, big movie head. Like, she just really was into all sorts of pop culture. And I think I picked that up very early on, my aunt too. And there's that part of it. But I realized over time, he doesn't just talk about pop culture, he talks about the inequities of pop culture and of like rewards and awards in this case. I think popular culture by definition is a standard because it's telling you this is what's popular. And if you are forming an opinion of yourself at a young age and you have the barometer of this look and this style and this way of being, you gravitate towards that. And so it really does inform you. And so I believe pop culture actually has an even more profound effect on insecure children and people because you are searching for a way to fit in, and media can tell you that how to do that. It provides a map in a way. Now this particular narrator, as we know, is also very concerned with social equity and is constantly railing about all of the inequities of society. And so I think his beef with the Oscars and the Grammys and the Emmys getting it wrong is that in a way it's like it's putting the wrong it's setting the wrong barometer, right? It's like it's calibrated in a way in which it shouldn't be. And so therefore, if that's wrong, how can we expect anyone else to get it right? Right? Like, if we don't, the thing that is most vaunted in our society and gets the most attention, if we are watching this inequity unfold in real time and it permeates all of our entire culture, how can we expect the rest to work out? I think he thinks that. I don't think that, by the way. I do get caught up in these sorts of things sometimes, but I like that as this idea. And as I was writing it, I was thinking, it's of course, it's like equity, equity, equity in every way in society, except never award this actress never award this actor, never award this perfect album. And why? And does it have to do with race? Does it have to do with gender? And so if even the arts get it wrong, what chance do we have, the rest of us? But like you said, I think some of it is levity also. It's just funny, right? Like it's also a nice break from the rest. To go on and on about like race and class is one thing, but if you throw in Taylor Swift and Beyonce, it gives it a, so you as a reader, you're able to engage with the text in a different way, maybe even just let your guard down a little.
You had the line in there like if Matthew McConaughey can get one, shouldn't everybody, or something like that, and that was great. That might be my favorite line in the book. But yeah, no, I mean I completely agree. It's interesting. It does feel like we're sort of shifting away from that a little bit, giving less importance to those sorts of things, maybe. But
Yeah,
maybe
I think you're right. I feel that too.
I was really interested in, you said it actually, intellectualizing my way to sanity is the
Yeah,
phrase that pops up in Middle Spoon.
yeah.
I didn't want a pill to make me better. I wanted to grit my way through emotional quagmire. I wanted to intellectualize my way to sanity. Right? There's a line, I forget who tells it to him. It might be Tracy. It's like you want an answer now, like for the rest of your life. Like you want to know now. You want to know how the next 30 years are going to look. You want to know how this is going to work, how this isn't. And so this lack of imagination he's attributing to everybody is actually very much there on his part as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
wonder how you thought about uncertainty, and perhaps the bigger question is, if he's trying to intellectualize his way to sanity, how are you as the author? Like, how do you see what is fiction doing for you when you're writing these things? Because you're not him trying to do this thing, but what is like sort of your perspective,
Yeah,
I guess.
that's a great question. The intellectualizing, that's a great observation because he is decrying the lack of imagination, as you say, on everyone else's part, and not accepting that his condition, who he is, the compulsion to need to know everything. That is what OCD is. It's a discomfort with uncertainty. It's a discomfort with like not having every bit of information at all times. Because for some people, a lack of the information feels unsafe. And that's, are you going to be with me forever and ever? Because if you don't think you're going to be with me forever and ever, right? And it's like, wait, that's ridiculous. Like that's not how life works. And so I think some of that is is what it motivates him, this needing to know at all times, which is why I brought the OCD in, because that's what OCD therapy looks like. It's like getting people to accept uncertainty and actually being comfortable with it. And it sounds so cheesy. And my friends who are Buddhist or who practice Buddhism, when I tell them this about OCD, they're like, that's Buddhism. And then you realize, yes, because these ideas get recycled from Eastern to Western and back and forth. Like people learn from each other. And so you build on stuff. But this idea that you just say to yourself, maybe, maybe not, it sounds so like new agey woo woo, but it is proven exposure therapy. You just accept uncertainty and you like effectively acculturate yourself to the feeling, the discomfort until that discomfort no longer it doesn't feel like discomfort. Yeah, and I think for me, I wouldn't when I'm writing, I feel good that I'm able to have the political conversations because it makes me feel like I'm contributing in a way to the world in a way that I think is important. I don't know if I'm doing it right. And trying to find that balance of like, I really want to communicate this idea to you, Alex. I really want the world to know how OCD functions. And now that I realize how prevalent it is, if this book ends up being like a public service announcement, all the better. At the same time, I want you to laugh and I want you to enjoy this story and to connect with the characters. And so as I'm writing it, that project, that challenge for me of finding the perfect balance of all of those things is very gratifying. It's very empowering for me. And so I do actually work out some demons that way. Not necessarily like I'm processing a personal thing, it's like I'm allowing myself to treat this as purpose. Like the writing is purposeful. It's not a vanity and it's not a time suck. It's actually like how am I contributing to the grander conversation in our society? And yeah, I don't want to talk too much about like my critics. I don't actually know for sure who my critics are. I just wanted to say that. Um, but I think being so political in a work of fiction, doing a lot of telling instead of showing, can be off-putting to people. And all I'm going to say is that I like novels of ideas and I like writing that blurs things. And so, yeah, I know my work is never going to be insert name of any great writer who is really story driven. That's not going to be me. I think all my work has a story, but it's a slice of life that's different from what's usually tackled, and then it really goes deep into like analysis. So it is personally gratifying for me. I wouldn't say that like when I'm writing it, I'm able to like let go of things for myself, but I do feel good about having this job.
You got to have both the analysis and the story. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
Dave.
Some of my favorite reading is when I feel like fiction, where suddenly I'm like, wait a second, this is philosophy. This is great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I was reading this story by Thomas Pynchon that I just
Mm.
like filmed a video on. And it's just an absolute sort of breakdown of the psychology of these German colonizers who go to Southwest Africa and commit the first genocide of like the 19th century in what is now Namibia. And I wasn't expecting it at all. And it was like the most insane thing I've ever read. And it was so brilliantly done. And
What's the name of the story?
so it's from the novel V, but it's like a standalone story. It's called Mondigan's Story. And
Okay,
it's absolutely I'll send you the video I recorded on it if you want.
please.
It's like
Yeah,
it was just like it was mind-blowing. And it's
I
so
want to read.
relatable
Yeah, I
to
want to read that for sure. And I spent a little bit of time in Namibia, so that's familiar with me. Yeah.
Oh, that's super interesting. You mentioned the lack of information, feeling unsafe. One of my favorite stories in here was the title one, which I think was last. People who
Mm.
report were stressed that scene where he is like, he doesn't have his phone or whatever for the first time in however long. And yeah, I've been thinking about like how you write. Technology is such a big part of our lives, and everybody just kind of is like, let's just not worry about putting it in the fiction or whatever, because it seems like such a hard thing to get around, but you did a great job of that.
Okay, that's my favorite story in the collection.
I like that one a lot. The public health thing, sort of like the analysis and the story, right? It's like you could have all this research done and it can feel sort of dehumanizing, right? Because you're thinking on such a broad level. But then you put it into a story and you can have both, right? You can act
Mhm.
it out through an individual perspective and make
Yeah,
it closer, I feel like. I don't know if that's
yeah.
how you feel.
No, every time I write something new, I'm like, wait, how am I? Because now that public health has become such a part of the conversation around my writing. Initially, I couldn't separate what interested me and the public health lens. They were just together all the time. And I have, since public health school, I do walk around a little bit, like I said before, like the Matrix, like where I'm seeing human interactions and I'm like, oh, they're exhibiting signs of scarcity and blah, blah, blah. you know, and I'm sort of always being like, this is bigger than this. Like the interpersonal means so little to me these days. And it meant everything to me when I was growing up. Everything was about the interaction between two individuals or communities. And now I'm like, no, it is so policy and institutional. Like that is the only way I look at things right now. But I'm writing this story and I introduce it again, a public health researcher, and he mentions his research on hierarchy. I've never done any research on hierarchy, by the way, but I have read a lot on it. So I put myself in the place of like one of these researchers. And as each section of the story happens, I wrote it in 10 sections. And I'm doing the thing I told you. Every day I just pick a section out of order and I read it and I try to treat it as a short story, each section. So it's part of the book, then one cohesive story. But I'm like, if this stood alone, if this was its own excerpt, would it be enjoyable from beginning to end, right? Nothing's filler. And the whole time I got into my head, I was like, wait, I mentioned hierarchy at the beginning. What if every section was a glimpse of hierarchy in ways people didn't even expect it? So that like you start to see it. And I was thinking of The Cathedral by Raymond Carver and how he builds this story, right? Or The Swimming Pool by Cheever. And that was the mindset I was saying. I was like, what if I just went broader? That's why, frankly, I love this collection because I think if I had, it tells a bigger story. Is what I wanted to tell. Like all the stories together tell one cohesive story in a way about this relationship, about like trying to make life work in this contemporary setting. And so, yeah, anyway, every time I sit down to write, I try to think about how I'm talking about public health and am I giving it its due and can it be structural? within the story? Can it be the structure of the story and not just the content of the story?
My final question will kind of tie into that and sort of the structure of the collection. But could we read from All the Bullets Were Made in My Country, which I think was my favorite story in the thing. This,
Oh.
she and her kid, me and mine. I also really like the last one.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I liked All the Bullets Were Made in My Country too a lot. I'm glad you enjoyed it. All right. The enduring memory of my first trip to El Salvador is of a mischievous experiment involving matches and perfume as fire accelerant. I destroyed my grandmother's underwear drawer and ruined a suitcase's worth of beauty care products that my mother had gifted her. My spoiled and arrogant Yankee grandchildren, she must have thought. On that trip, I slept alongside my sisters and mother in a gray room of exposed concrete inside a two-story house that rested at the bottom of La Colina in Santa Tecla, a small suburb of La Libertad. Feral dogs with more bark than meat on their bones sauntered the empty roads on thin, dirt-dusted legs. A tin-roofed shop on the corner sold an entrancing array of candy and accepted our coins well before El Salvador officially adopted U.S. currency as its own. 200 kilometers east in El Mozote, a village near the border with Honduras, a U.S. trained battalion killed close to 900 evangelical Salvadorians under suspicion of collaborating with rebel forces. By that point, the civil war is being fought almost exclusively in the countryside, far from the capital. I don't remember anyone uttering a word about the war. What I recall instead is my grandmother preparing breakfast but never eating with us. She remained in the yard collecting water and flesh from coconuts she'd cracked open with her trusty dagger shaped rock. After breakfast, she ran errands while my grandfather took the bus into the city center to attend Mass. They returned in time for lunch, through which my grandmother sat quietly, and after which she disappeared again to an open air market or another to buy the ingredients she'd forgotten during her morning excursion. In the evenings, my grandfather allowed us to climb him while he read his right wing newspapers, which he held with the hand of one arm, while the other trembled uselessly at his side, incapable of gripping anything. The result of nerve damage from a bullet that ripped through his shoulder at a pro government rally in the 1960s. Men in uniform had somehow mistaken him for a counter protester.
He spends the whole story, the narrator, thinking about how like he's spending time with the enemy or whatever, right wingers in El Salvador, but he doesn't seem to recognize the answer given to us in the title until he's sitting in the airport in Miami on Valentine's Day. Everybody's throwing their garbage everywhere. And yeah, I thought it was so wonderfully constructed. But my question actually, because maybe we can just end on a fun one, was about the title and titles in general because I feel like this one, like I said, it's doing a lot of work. Whether you actually see it there and then carry that with you into the story, I don't know. She and Her Kid, Me and Mine, The Caretakers, The People Who Report More Stress, wonderful title. Like, I wonder how important those are to you. Because yeah, I'm like that with everything. I want to title every chapter and make everything so significant and really I almost care more about those than the writing itself. Uh,
Yes.
about that stuff.
It's a great question. And yeah, I do struggle and I'm learning to let go. Middle Spoon, for example, every chapter had a title. And I worked so hard on every single one of those letters having a title. And then at some point I was reading, I don't know if it was my partner or if it was me, at some point I was like, this is doing a lot of work. And I hate that, frankly, when I read other people's work where they kind of do the thinking for me. I want for some things to be slightly unclear so I can feel like I'm putting it all together. Like they've given me enough pieces for me to prove the rest. And I cut every single title out of Middle Spoon. And that was a lot of darlings to kill because there were 72 emails. So there were 72 titles that I got rid of. Anyway, so that was difficult. The people who report more stress for short stories, I have a lot of trouble coming. It's almost easier for me to come up with book titles than it is for me to come up with short story titles because you're right. I don't want to do too much work, but I want it to like be the kind of title that grabs your eye and is very relevant. I like the idea of writing titles that are really long, like 2 cents. You know that Fiona Apple book, When the Pawn, which is it's a poem and it's the entire title and it's When the Pawn ellipsis, but it is a massive title. I love that. I think that's so fun and creative and outside the bounds of, but when push comes to shove, I'm always like, okay, we can go with the three-word title, because it just, I don't know. Sometimes I'm like, maybe the excitement I feel around the details doesn't match the experimentation of the story or doesn't. And so then it feels like it's just gimmicky and not really organic, I guess. But, she and her kid and me and mine, I liked that idea because it was very much four people trapped in an apartment, and it was about their relationships. And I thought of that 1969 or early 70s film called Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, which I believe was based on a play. And I loved that all my life as a kid. I didn't even see the movie until I was in my 20s, but I knew that title because I was a big film buff. And I remember being like, what a title for a movie, Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice. It's just like, it's almost like lazy, but it also does the work. And I mean, it also just works perfectly. And so she and her kid and me and mine, I think captures the vibe of the story. And I think it was named three other things before that. I can't tell you what they were off the top of my head. I'd
Mhm.
have to look at like my word files. But the people who report more stress was called something else. It was published in the Boston Review as another with another title, I think. And then when we were coming up with the story collection, maybe it did have that title already. My friend Lisa, who I mentioned before, the writer of Activities of Daily Living, she said the people who report more stress. What a line! She said that's really good. And I thought, could that be? And so then when it came time to choose the titles for the book, we were like, it's either the people who report more stress or what was the other possibility? It was supposed to be, I think, the first 200 years of Eduardo was the title, but everyone thought it sounded speculative. But it
Mm.
was getting at the Six Times of Alan, that story about the
Yeah.
psychiatrist, where he explained this idea, which I learned in public health, which was that the diffusion of innovations theory, which is a sociological theory, essentially says that it takes a long time for even the right idea to diffuse through society, even when it's been proven, even when it has the support of government. And famously, there's a story about like how scurvy killed more British Marines and merchant Marines than any war ever did. And when a Scottish captain who was also a scientist realized that his men who ate lemons or other citrus fruit didn't die, he conducted this kind of study on the boat. And the guys who ate the lemons and the oranges didn't die because they got vitamin C. And the
Mhm.
guys who didn't eat them, they died. So he was like, oh, I think it has something to do with this fruit. And he told everyone that would listen. And then it still didn't work. And then the US, the UK, what is it, the British naval, whatever, they changed their policy and then required them to do it. And it's people still didn't adopt it because they were like, it can't be that. It took 200 years for it to become official policy and for people to actually follow the guideline. And in the meantime, tens or hundreds of thousands of mostly men died from scurvy. And so from that idea comes like this theory that it takes a lot on many different layers for an idea to actually become popular and accepted. It takes a lot. And in that case, it took 200 years. So then I thought, this guy is trying to communicate so much in all of these stories. And I thought the first 200 years of Eduardo, because he refers to 200 years in that. I liked it, but people thought it was speculative.
Well, I love the long titles. That's very interesting, the way that all worked out. Well, thank you for talking with me today. I'm sorry it took so much time. I always come into the interviews with 45 minutes in mind, and then it always balloons up into an hour and a half. But
No, and thank you for being so thoughtful. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.